The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
All right, so let's get started. There has been a small change in our plans. Brigadier-General O'Malley is unfortunately unable to join us this afternoon, but we do have a short video to present on his behalf. And we also have the commander of the Canadian Defense Academy, Major General Craig Aitchison, and Dr. Andrea Sharon, the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba, to lead our discussion panel after the movie. So I go ahead, sir. Like this, I know you want to get this moving. Great discussion.
Thanks, Wendy. Bon après-midi à tous. Alors, un peu de changement au programme and as flexibility.
So we have a slight change to the program.
Never when you're the surprisee, but it is my pleasure to introduce Brigadier General Derek O'Malley, who will speak to us. He's unavailable to answer questions and answers, regrettably, and you'll see why at the beginning of his presciently prepared video from a few days ago. So, Brigadier General Derek Maestro O'Malley, and I was really looking forward to having him here to see the roots of that, and with the recent discussions about how call signs are assigned in the Royal Canadian Air Force, I was keen to see how that was going to be done. Anyway, is the senior U.S. military officer in Canada and serves as a deputy commander for Canadian North American Air Defense Region, as well as the deputy force air component commander for 1st Canadian Air Division in Winnipeg. He's a distinguished graduate of Brigham Young University. He has accumulated more than 3,000 flight hours in operational flying assignments on 3 key platforms, all of which you will see featured in his video. The F-16, F-35A, and A-10 Charlie. And so very much a theme of Top Gun. And for those that are young in the room, Top Gun was a movie back in the 80s starring this guy named Tom Cruise. Also a distinguished graduate and former instructor at the U.S. Air Force Weapons School. He's held a number of leadership positions at all levels and has commanded twice fighter wings. And he has 19 years of combat operations experience. He is deployed in support of operations Northern Watch, Southern Watch, Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, Resolute Support, and Freedom Sentinel. So without further ado, we'll run General O'Malley's video. It's about 18 minutes, and then Andrea and I will do our best to facilitate a conversation that follows. Thanks.
Good afternoon. It is my honor to speak with you today. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. Unfortunately, my travel plans fell apart, and now I've been exposed to COVID. So we'll make this work. But the thoughts that I'm going to share with you here today are derived exclusively from the mind of my boss, as General Glenn Van Herk, the commander of NORAD and NORTHCOM. Now, I've known General Van Herk since I was a young captain, and he was then Lieutenant Colonel Van Herk. And even then, it was very clear that he was outpacing all of us on the intellectual front. No doubt he is a gifted strategic thinker, but more importantly, he's skilled at communicating complex strategic topics in a way that actually drives action in a whole-of-government approach. So I will use his words, literally, and in most cases I won't be paraphrasing. These will be direct quotes, and I'll say what I believe he would say if he were here with you today. And ultimately, I'd like you all to walk away from this with a good understanding of where he's pointing NORAD in his strategy to defend our homeland. So if you think back when NORAD first stood up, the primary threats to the homeland were bombers from over the pole delivering gravity weapons and of course, ICBMs. Today, our homeland faces threats from all domains, including fractional bombardment from space, hypersonics and cruise missiles that evade our radar detection capabilities, and submarines capable of firing nuclear or conventional missiles in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. To be clear, our homeland is already under attacks in the cyber domain and in the information space. With these types of challenges, our theory of victory cannot only be about achieving kinetic kills. That is a losing strategy, both militarily and financially. Our primary strategy should not hinge on shooting down cruise missiles over Washington, D.C. or Ottawa. It's interesting to look at how our strategies have evolved over the past 30 years. From a U.S. perspective, since August of 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, our national focus has been centered on the Middle East through Operations Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. So during this 3 decades period, the United States focused on projecting power forward in order to take the fight to rogue regimes, violent extremists, or other organizations. This led to a tendency towards tactical thinking against individual actors rather than strategic thinking and analysis to confront and compete with peer competitors. It also instilled the preference for kinetic solutions over other options, including a deterrence and an acquisition strategy that favored expansive systems to confront single threats in one domain instead of multi-threat, multi-domain systems. These right-of-launch response plans, rather than left-of-launch denial and deterrence efforts, constrained our actions and our decision-making. In essence, this approach forced us into a reactive posture, vice a proactive posture. Now, today, our strategic nuclear deterrent remains the foundation of our defense. Deterrence by punishment, which depends on the adversary's fear of nuclear retaliation, is not likely going to be sufficient to address the wide array of threats we face today. For too long, we have implicitly relied on and assumed that the strategic nuclear deterrent is adequate to prevent our competitors from attacking our homeland. But we also need a complementary conventional deterrent to defend against or respond to smaller-scale conventional attacks on the homeland. We need a balanced approach to deterrence that allows us to deter the full range of kinetic and non-kinetic options available to our potential adversaries. To this end, the U.S. Secretary of Defense has directed the DoD to change its approach to deterrence. He's asked the DoD to think beyond traditional deterrence methods, instead using a new approach he refers to as integrated deterrence. Integrated deterrence, in his words, employs a mix of technology, operational concepts, and capabilities all woven together in a networked way that is so credible and flexible and formidable that it will give any adversary pause. In the past, we have consistently fixated on kinetic kill capabilities to meet all threats. Leadership, including General Van Herk and myself, were fighter pilots. We grew up and achieved success as tacticians and operators first. So kinetic capabilities are what we know and what we are comfortable with. But a reliance on platform delivery systems and weapons alone leads to a responsive rather than a proactive strategy, and we've got to do better. We owe our senior decision makers better options. From a capability standpoint, we also treat the homeland differently than other theaters. Because the homeland was a relative sanctuary for more than 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM forces have been trained and configured for day-to-day and steady-state operations, not for the possibility of conflict in the homeland. Today, we do not have a persistent capability to generate high ops tempo and sustained operations within the United States and Canada in response to crisis, and we have not routinely equipped or trained our continental-based forces to operate in all environments, especially the Arctic. So we must regain the ability and mindset to be ready to fight tonight, because our requirement is not to be ready for day-to-day operations, but to be prepared for crisis every day. So that frames some of the challenges we face, but let me shift to the solutions and get into more details of General Van Herk's homeland defense design. When General Van Herk assumed command of NORAD and NORTHCOM, he focused the command on 4 principles: improving all-domain awareness, gaining information dominance, and achieving decision superiority over our competitors, all under the umbrella of global integration. So let me break these down further. Let's start with all-domain awareness. This is General Van Herk's top strategic priority and his best military advice on where we ought to be focusing our investments. You cannot deter, and you certainly cannot defeat something you can't detect. So when he talks about domain awareness, he's talking about undersea, land, air, space, and cyber, all domains. This capability increases warning time for national leadership against multiple threats, expanding available response options. Systems like improved over-the-horizon radars, polar communications, joint all-domain command and control, fixed seabed surveillance systems, undersea cable-laying ships, polar radars, and counter-small UAS detection all appear on NORAD and U.S. NORTHCOM's integrated priority list. Investment in these exceedingly capable technologies will ultimately allow the earliest detection of sea-launched cruise missiles and small UAS and hypersonic glide vehicles. It will also give us a significant advantage in the remote regions of the Arctic, which is quickly becoming a region of global competition. I'll talk more about that competition in a moment. Information dominance is the second element of the framework and is General Van Herk's second strategic priority. This is about harvesting the massive amount of data from our all-domain awareness capabilities and translating it into something that is immediately useful for decision makers. If you think about it, you can have all the domain awareness in the world, but if that awareness or data isn't linked back to decision makers in a useful way, it's not really relevant. Information dominance is all about connecting our sensors back to decision makers. And from General Van Herk's view, the future fight will be won or lost based on our ability to achieve information dominance by connecting data from all domain awareness sensors to flexible and responsive decision superiority options. All too often, we actually have the domain awareness we need. It's just not shared, or it's stovepiped or lost on the cutting room floor. We can't analyze things for days and hours. We need near real-time analysis. Effective information dominance systems must ingest, aggregate, process, display, and disseminate data quickly and reliably by leveraging the potential of AI and machine learning. The data needs to be pried from existing stovepipes, flattened, and brought into a DoD cloud-based computing environment in order to enable decision superiority. And this is the ability to make faster and better decisions than our potential adversaries. And this will enable us to deter, deny, and if necessary, defeat attacks. General Van Herk often says the one thing he can never have enough of is time, so he is focused on producing the elements most important to senior decision makers: time and options. So together, all domain awareness and information dominance puts decision superiority in the hands of decision makers. However, we must not confuse decision superiority with development of traditional kinetic defeat mechanisms. At its heart, decision superiority is about giving senior leaders options. Decision superiority expands the aperture beyond kinetic kill into non-kinetic solutions. NORAD and U.S. Northcom are platform agnostic. The particular system chosen is not as important as its ability to be employed globally, across all domains, across all classification levels, and be accessible from the tactical all the way up to the strategic levels. Affordability and rapid deployment are also key considerations because our competitors are moving swiftly. Now, the technology I'm describing isn't science fiction or fantasy. We've already demonstrated that what I'm describing is absolutely achievable and in many cases far more affordable than kinetic-focused solutions. NORAD and U.S. Northcom are already moving concepts into prototypes and into operations, bringing an information-dominant homeland defense architecture one step closer to reality. One example of a model for the future is the Pathfinder program, which U.S. Northcom and industry partners have been working on for the past few years, with contracting assistance, of course, from the Defense Innovation Unit here in Canada. Pathfinder is now in use at our air defense sectors as a battle management tool. It ingests air domain sensor data from multiple sources, including commercial and military radars, leverages software automation, and uses machine learning models to produce a fused common operating picture and decision superiority tool. Now, Pathfinder did not start by picking a specific solution or platform, and it was not approached as a military problem. Instead, it was approached as a data problem for industry partners to solve in order to improve our domain awareness. By viewing the problem as a data problem rather than one of equipment or hardware, we were able to quickly improve capabilities and unlock terabytes of hidden information. Platform capability development efforts often take decades, but software development and cloud computing move much faster. Unlike hardware procurement programs, software development takes advantage of Moore's law, and the cost of these tools are a fraction of the amount invested in most of our major weapon systems. So as a means of validating some of these information dominance tools, NORAD and Northcom took data available during a recent real-world crisis and processed it through the tools. In doing this, we determined that had the global information dominance tools been in use before the crisis, actionable information would have been identified 2 to 3 days in advance of traditional methodologies. So as I've highlighted, the advantage of having more time to make a decision cannot be overstated. In a future crisis, it could mean the difference between peaceful resolution and unintentional escalation. With extra time, commanders could select deterrence options proactively rather than responding to provocation in a way that increases the risk of strategic deterrence failure. Commanders could begin mobilization or targeted actions to put forces in place to counter adversary movements, increase readiness postures, or use diplomacy to defuse the situation. The goal of all these actions is identical: conventional deterrence options that show adversaries the risk of their actions exceed the gains. The final element of the framework is global integration. Now, global integration requires cultural and procedural changes across the DoD and the DND. Other combatant commands, the Canadian Joint Operations Command, the Joint Staffs in the Pentagon, and the National Defense Headquarters, and even the services must recognize that the current region-by-region approach will not be sufficient given the current and future capabilities and global reach of our competitors. Now, our competitors' actions are global, not regional. So our current regionally focused plans do not address the fact that our competitors or potential adversaries are not constrained by our organizational boundaries. The days of having a single supported combat commander are over, and we need the ability to collaborate globally and across all domains in near real time to present options to our nation's leaders that have considered global risk, resources, and readiness. With these strategic principles as the backdrop, it should be obvious that General Van Herk's Homeland Defense design does not start in our homelands. Quite the opposite. He wants to generate effects forward before the threat becomes a threat to our homelands. And this starts with allies and partners forward through day-to-day campaigning, clearly and methodically demonstrating our responsiveness, readiness, resilience, and resolve. Through this focused campaigning, we get inside the gray matter of anybody that would ever think about attacking our homeland. And we make them realize that they can never bring us to our knees and be successful. That can't just be a military effort or objective. That's all of us, two countries leveraging our best whole-of-governments approach, united together with unwavering resolve. And to do this effectively, we also must have access to forces that are organized, trained, and equipped to operate throughout the entire AOR. So NORAD and NORTHCOM's AOR extends from the North Pole to Central America, from the center of the Atlantic Ocean out into the Pacific. In many cases, General Van Herk can't get forces to operate in the Arctic because they're either not available to NORAD because they're committed elsewhere, or if he does get access to the forces, they're often not trained or equipped to operate in the Arctic. Now, I will say this. You should be very proud of your Canadian Armed Forces. From my view, they're the best in the world at operating in the high north, but there's still much work to be done for all of us on that front. The logistical challenges of Arctic operations are immense. However, we should not cede the Arctic to Russia or China. So I'll end on a positive note. Let me cue the inspirational music. I've been a part of many coalitions and combined and joint combat operations throughout my career. And never during those experiences have I seen two teams integrate and work together as effectively as the Canadian and U.S. militaries. Through the NORAD lens, we blur together. You almost forget who's Canadian and who's American. And I don't view the defense of Canada and the defense of the United States as two separate problems. You might have noticed in my words today, I deliberately said our homeland, a singular noun denoting both Canada and the United States together. No doubt, our asymmetric advantage is our network of allies and partners, something that Russia or China don't have. But we need to move out with a sense of urgency every single day because the challenges are growing. I can't tell you how honored I am to wake up every day and execute the most noble mission on the planet, defending our homeland side by side with my Canadian friends. Sincerely, I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this great conference.
A really nice round of applause. He can't hear you. So just before we open the floor for discussion, and what Andrea and I are hoping to do is actually generate a discussion with those in the room. So Commander, Canadian Defense Academy. My last job was the Deputy Commanding General for Operations in U.S. Army Alaska, now 11th Division Airborne. My predecessor was Rock Pelche, so you got a couple folks with experience in that from that perspective. Scott Clancy's in the room. Scott was the Senior Canadian and Alaska NORAD region before heading back down to NORAD Northcom for a year for his second or third time there. And so he's got a lot of NORAD Northcom experience, and I'm sure there are others in the room that can share their perspectives as well. I'll make a couple comments. I'll hand the floor to Andrea, and then we'll open the floor. So Derek touched on the four principles for General Van Herk: improving all domain awareness, gaining information dominance, achieving decision superiority, and global integration. So when you think about improving all domain awareness, we've all seen the challenge of joint in the Canadian Armed Forces, those of us that live in that space, and the integration in a binational or multinational environment is complexified by 100-fold. But we've seen progress. We did a major joint exercise in Alaska in February of 2020, where we integrated Canadian sensors into the ANR NORAD Northcom COP. And so that was considered a huge success at that time. And that was 3 years ago almost, so who knows how much progress has been made there. He mentioned acquisition for the theaters that we're operating in. Acquisition for the Arctic is hard because of the nature of the environment, right? High altitude, high elevation, really cold. and large swaths of the Arctic outside of connectivity to things like satellites. So until there's a persistent satellite presence that can cover that part of the world, we're reliant on technology that limits some capabilities. On the Canadian side, the pan-domain force employment concept has not yet been completely ratified. We're starting to get through that process. But until we get there, how do we even begin to make sure that we can operate and prepare to operate across domains as well? Gaining information dominance speaks to digital transformations that we're just starting to talk about. The CAF Digital Transformation Campaign Plan has just been released, and so I would offer we're behind there. And it also informs how we not just integrate digitally, but also how we procure digitally. And so we touched on the challenge of software procurement and Moore's Law. How do we do that in an environment where defense procurement is kind of built a certain way? Achieving decision superiority speaks to AI and machine learning. How do we integrate that into our processes? How do we prepare our people to operate in that domain? And how do we make sure that the decision makers understand what AI has contributed to in the decision-making process so they can account for that when they make that final human decision? So just a couple things to think about as we think about the 4 principles that General Van Herk has adopted for NORAD Northcom. Andrea, over to you.
Thanks. So from my perspective, of course, it's always the question of, well, how does Canada fit into this? Because as I think we all realize, we are highly dependent, a product of the U.S. combatant command system. And in an Arctic context, that becomes particularly difficult because you have 3 combatant commands, U.S. Northcom, EUCOM, and Indo-PACOM, all with responsibilities in the Arctic. The other difficulty is that the U.S. Northcom assets are often held by another combatant command. And hence, this is why we have this focus on needing to integrate both information, I would also add capabilities, but then the question always becomes, well, what is Canada's contribution? And we have to look at the relationship with the U.S. It is a binational relationship, and that is unique in that it's not bilateral. It's not Canada doing things over here and the U.S. doing things over here, and together we're doing things for North America. This is Canada and the U.S. thinking North America. And that is a very special relationship, but it can also mean a very uneven relationship when you're dealing with a U.S. military and 2 commands, NORAD and U.S. Northcom. How do we fit in with our system, which is differently set up? And how do we ensure that we can be that reliable partner that stays within our ideas and values, but doesn't overstretch us beyond the point of being able to perform? After all, both militaries are really struggling with what the Americans call defense support of civil authorities, what we call for request assistance, think fires, floods, hurricanes. We are increasingly being asked to change the tires on a car that is moving. And we don't have the luxury of saying, okay, could everybody just stop while we figure out all of the issues associated with the Canadian and U.S. military and recruitment challenges and aggression overseas, and now we add this requirement to make sure that we are focusing on the continent. So that's where I would start it.
Okay, so happy to open the floor to questions, and we'll facilitate a conversation between you and you.
I can answer the one question about his call sign, Maestro. He has a twin who is a conductor and professional musician. So
all right.
Hence Maestro.
Any other questions? Okay, way in the back.
Wonderful. It's on? Well, marvellous. Thank you ever so much. Thomas Hughes, University of Manitoba. Just a quick question. We keep hearing this phrase about whole of government approach to defence and security. When do you think we're going to start seeing non-military agencies sitting on panels like this alongside the military and actually having that discussion from their perspective rather than from the military trying to understand how it can best use non-military agencies to achieve its goals?
So those happen. Well, no, they do. 6 months ago, Joint Operations Symposium 22 had multi-departmental panels talking about similar topics that relate to defense and security. I think, though, that I think the challenge that Canada faces is and this is a recurring theme at JOS, is we don't have a national security strategy. And so until we have one where we can align all of the governmental departments responsible in that security domain, it makes it difficult, I think, for any government to orient all of government onto a particular security challenge. That, combined with a lack of an existential threat, makes it difficult for Canadians and, by extension, governments, I think, to support a strong security and defense agenda. And so, as a result, often what ends up happening is the force of last resort becomes the force of first resort, because the focus of the provinces and the other federal governmental departments aren't on those things that consume us as security practitioners perhaps as much. But that's the unfiltered answer from me. Andrew, over to you for probably a more eloquent one.
No, not at all. But I would think there's also an element of they speak very, very different languages. And one of the things that I think in particular Canada can learn from the United States is the change to FEMA, which is the civilian arm to do DISCA, how much they were helped and trained by the U.S. military, but then it was turned over to them to develop their own operations and systems and connections into the various state governor systems. We have, in theory, Public Safety Canada, but we somehow miss an impetus to have an operational element, often to civilian agencies. Of course, there are exceptions, Department of Transportation, the Coast Guard, et cetera. But I think with the number of disasters that are coming upon us and the fact that we cannot we cannot not defend the homeland and not assist with these disasters and aid with our alliance requirements, that we are going to have to find a way to bring up the operational capacity and planning expertise, which is what the military excels at, give those skills to civilian departments to be able to take up that load.
And we are moving out in that respect. So with my Canadian Defence Academy hat on, we have two key programs. We have multiple programs that also do this at a smaller scale, but the two key programs at the Canadian Forces College, National Security Program and Joint Command and Staff Program, both offer vacancies to executives from across government. National Security Program EX1s to 3, and the Joint Command and Staff Program more at the action officer level. The National Security Program has 11 seats for those in government. And that compares with 11 seats for members of the Canadian Armed Forces. So it's, and then 11 seats for international students. The Joint Command and Staff Program this year will have 3 seats, and next year we're aiming for 12. And that's to both begin to build relationships, but also the capacities within other governmental departments. When you rewind, 15 years, when we were in Afghanistan, we achieved a level of integration, and I would go so far to say whole of government approach, in Kandahar, because we had the architecture in place and we had the reason, right? So it wasn't an existential threat, but it was a government priority. And so we had a representative of Canada to Kandahar, the ROC, combined with the Task Force Kandahar commander, and they were, binational, they had shared powers and responsibilities, if you will, for within their lanes. So provincial reconstruction was the responsibility of the ROC, and security operations was the responsibility of Commander TFK. And there were multiple government departments contributing to both of those sides of the paradigm. that faded away, and I think we've forgotten what the benefit of that was. And so however it is that we would choose to prepare for the next time we want to do that, really is, at the very least, a DM to DM level discussion. But the Canadian Armed Forces is leaning into it the ways that we can for the reasons that we all understand.
I think Scott Clancy has a question, but I think one of the problems too is we're still designed to fight World War II with domain-specific component commanders. Maybe need to think about that in the context of today's threat vectors. Scott?
So I might add to the answer, because I think the United States Department of Defense and the United States government has taken on a very different look with respect to how they deal with threats, whether it's domestic, whether it's defense support, civil authority, from a whole of government approach. A lot of it had to do with the responses to a variety of disasters. Hurricane Sandy is a classic example of where FEMA fell apart. A governor now no longer trusts the ability of the federal government to come to the aid of. People die, blah, blah, blah. But what happened was DHS, the government operations centers, had to stand up, and they had to do things in a much more holistic way. Right after that, Georgia, Crimea, these things, and especially the cyber effects that came on the heels of this and the denial of service attacks that occurred across the United States, fundamentally changed the approaches with respect to how the United States was going to deal with security. It was not going to be U.S. Cyber Command leading that. It had to be DHS. They are the ones that were going to interface with business. So this, to Dr. Pichet's thing of saying that those threats are going to manifest themselves across those domains or in those areas that have nothing to do with the domains that the military sees their threats, right? Hammer and nail for the military. The American military or the American government has come to grips with this. Their global combatant command structure actually enables this because they can provide that interface. Now I'm going to say something that everybody who's a member of CJOC is not going to like. CJOC is woefully incapable of executing this function. Woefully incapable because they're completely under-resourced to do it, but they don't have the span of control. It's way too large. You cannot fight the next global war saying, I'm going to do everything that NATO's doing, I'm going to do everything that NORAD's doing. You can't. So they have to divide those responsibilities. And they have to divide those responsibilities so that the government of Canada can be pushed into defining and designing how they want to respond within those domains. This is all going to take money. You can't have a temporarily manned government operations center that's continuously monitoring the cyber. Okay, that doesn't work, folks, right? And so this is where that problem space sits. Craig's absolutely right. One by one, take a specific operation. We're real good at Canadians of just getting down and okay, what do we have to do to cooperate? No. And then once the operation's over, we go home, right? And then all that goes away, and then we reinvent the thing the next time this happens. So it's concurrent and continuous structures that General Van Erck is going. That's why his campaign plan that implements those four things is focused on maintaining resilience of the domestic side, the civilian side. So what you see is, as a military going, hey, we're going to have to lean into this. And he's got a partner in DHS, but he has no partner north of the border. Public safety's not biting, and. So that's a real problem for him. So I hope that maybe answers a little bit better your question.
Thanks, Scott. Over here on the left.
You have a question?
Perfect. Madeline Redfern from Iqaluit. I just wanted to make a comment and pose it as a question. I mean, part of what we need to do is be much more innovative, and that's a word that's often used, unfortunately. I don't think the Department of Science, Economic Development and Innovation is actually innovative. We need to be strategic and smart with our defense and civil investments. We talked about earlier this morning that things need to be dual purpose or multi-purpose infrastructure that is also multi-user, multi-beneficial. We need to develop northern and indigenous capacity. We cannot be in the same situation as World War II or post-World War II, where we developed the DEW line sites and it had our people eating at the US garbage dumps. Okay? So as we begin to look at modernizing NORAD, we need to also ensure that not only those investments that are for infrastructure is good for our communities, but that our people in the North and Indigenous people are trained in these technologies. So this morning we heard about sort of, and no disrespect, that, we have great traditional knowledge of people who are whalers, and fishermen and seamstresses, but we also are developing capacities. We have a woman, CEO, Indigenous woman in Alaska, who is Pole Arctic doing artificial intelligence. We have in Iqaluit, Arctic UAV, where Indigenous people are learning how to do drones and 3D rendering and use that software. As Canada, though, what I'm seeing is that we've developed Ocean Supercluster in the East Coast. We've developed Digital Supercluster in the West Coast. And even in the consultations of the Ocean Supercluster, there were 6 across the country, none in the north, despite the fact that 50% of Canada's coastline is in the Arctic. What was the response when we said, when and where is going to be the northern consultation? We can't afford it. Mm-hmm. Excuse me? You can't afford to do consultations in the north? Join us by Zoom. Do you not understand what my telecommunications capability is like? I can't always connect by Zoom, and even if I do, it's unstable, it's unreliable, low throughput, which means usually everything has to be blacked out, and then it's extremely expensive. So what we need is to see a commitment by both United States and Canada that in NORAD modernization, that the Northerners and Indigenous people are going to be part of those investments in our infrastructure, investments in our people. And I yet to see, a real commitment for that. And also when and if there are partnerships, we need to make sure that the government of Canada ensures those partnerships are real and that we're not tokenizing Northern Indigenous participation. If you do not see an Inuk speaking on behalf of Inuit, if you do not see an Inuk representing Inuit, are you really dealing with a true Indigenous business or a true Indigenous organization or a true Indigenous development corporation? I challenge that you need to make sure that we are in the room and that we're actually part of those conversations, and that consultation's important, but it's not the end game. The end game is meaningful participation. And I've yet to see that. So I just sort of open it up because I think, it's provocative because we cannot do what we did in the 1950s.
Absolutely no argument. Absolutely no argument whatsoever. And, it's why the importance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can't just be a tick in the box. It has to be understood. Article 30, which has particular requirements of especially militaries vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples, needs to be part of what the CDA is teaching their officers, their NCMs, and it has to be part of the culture. It can't just be, this is part of my checklist of things to do. So I find some hopeful developments in the fact that Nausitut, an Inuit majority-owned company, has the contract right now for the North Warning System maintenance, and I believe they have another contract. But we need more of that, and as you absolutely rightly say, until you have access to fast, reliable internet, then the education and training opportunities that then make you the leaders of these companies and the decision makers, that's always going to be an impediment, and that absolutely has to change. And it fits with what the military needs. They need fast, reliable communication. So for heaven's sakes, let's get together and find a way to make it happen for both. The military can have their high side, but it's not an either or, it's a both.
What Andrea said, but Madeline, what I would add to that is I think there's some, based on my limited experience in Alaska in the sense of how Indigenous communities cooperate through the state into defense to provide significant real life support to installations. I think there's a model there that perhaps Canada can look at and and kind of model after. To Andrew's comment about how it is that we help our people better understand the relationship between the Indigenous peoples and the members of the military, et cetera. You know, that we're talking generational change there, and it's going to take time. But what I would tell you is that at my headquarters, I now have an Indigenous advisor. She's First Nations West Coast. She has access to the Indigenous network across the Canadian Armed Forces, which represents all the different communities from all 3 Indigenous nations. The Royal Military College now has an Indigenous scholar who's Métis, and she's looking at all of the programs that we run at RMC to make sure that they are not just EDI compliant, but indigenized as well. So we're taking steps to help people better understand, you know, everything that they need to understand to, you know, to be co-stewards of this nation, and in particular the North. All of our programs visit the North to better understand the challenges of the North, whether it's a security challenge, a social challenge, an infrastructure challenge, or whatever. And so they spend time in Iqaluit, in Yellowknife, they go up to Res Bay or somewhere else to see a more northern perspective. And again, that's all meant to help them better understand that complex issue. So again, you won't get any pushback from me either. Thanks for your comment. Oui, madame. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I agree entirely with Madeleine. Now, here's a real problem that technicians and technologists up north have been encountering for the last 10 to 15 years. Yes, we should have more public business involved with us. Here's my problem. I have a piece of equipment up north that goes down. Within that piece of equipment, there is a particular device that is proprietary to a private business. I'm not allowed to open the box and solder the thing that I think is burnt. I have to send it down south, have it fixed by that private company. It will take a month and a half. So you are 2 months up there with absolutely nothing. The piece of equipment will not work because you're missing the device. And that is something that is real now. It's happening right now. So yes, up north, we can train as many native as we can as technicians and technologists. But if we do not have the right to open a box and to fix a device, then this is a problem. And it's going to be a problem for security. So this is real. This is happening right now.
No, great point. And you know, the complexities of generating military readiness in the North speak to that challenge directly, but also speak to the challenge of, you know, self-sustainability for the military force that comes north, because we can't rely on the small communities that we're going to be where we're going to be operating, because of the supply chain realities that northern communities, especially those that are only serviced by water or air, and how they maintain their own requirements for fuel, food, water, etc. So it's you know, readiness, and I don't just mean military readiness, but civilian infrastructure readiness and military readiness across the Arctic is a significant challenge that is going to take a whole of government solution to approach, and in fact whole of nation, because it does speak to your comment with respect to industry's role here. And I don't know how mature the conversation is amongst the senior policymakers with respect to that, but my hope is that it's, you know, that they are talking about these and understand the nature and scope of those challenges.
Sir,
Blue
Dr.
light.
Sharon, thank you for being, you know, so flexible and in helping us guide us on this discussion today. So thank you very much. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Sharon, you get to stay up
I get
here
to
for
stay
the
up
rest
here.
of the afternoon. You're in the hot seat.
Poor them.
So, sir, thank you very much.